So what do you gentlemen know about what's happened politically in this country in the last 48 hours?
Very little, to be honest. I've
About to
watched a
change.
couple videos, read a couple articles.
Are you aware of what the agreement the NDP and the Liberals had? Do you know what actually that entailed and what's cancelled?
The only thing I heard was from CBC this morning, in which case the NDP had agreed to support the Liberals, provided that certain policies of theirs got attention. I guess would be the best simple way to put it.
Yeah. So in a minority government situation, you have the other parties can basically put a non-confidence motion at almost any time and say, we don't want the government to exist and we all want to join up and make the government fall and force an election. Now, in the days when Harper was prime minister, they tried that twice. And Harper went to the governor general and said, I really don't want to knock the government down right now. Would you mind proroguing parliament, which basically means to pause parliament, and we'll come back in a couple months and just restart it. Governor General said, who Harper appointed, said, yeah, sure, no problem. So the non-confidence motion went nowhere. So they did that twice. So Trudeau could do the same thing. But the NDP right now, over the rail strike, if you remember what happened a couple weeks ago, so the government forced them back to work, which is basically what everybody in the country wanted them to do. And so the NDP said, well, if they do that, we're going to rip out the agreement. So apparently the video that Singh had put up was filmed weeks ago in anticipation of all this. But unfortunately for the NDP, because they're such pansies, the only people that really care now are center-left voters who never liked Singh to begin with, but used to sort of hold their nose and vote NDP. They're all angry right now because all the stuff the NDP has put forth that the Liberals had to adopt as part of their agreement, like the dental care, child care, pharmacare, all those sort of, and a bunch of other smaller things. If the Conservatives get in, they're just going to cancel it all. They've already said they're going to cancel it all. So Singh has basically taken the last 3 or 4 years of progress.
And just threw it away.
Yeah, he's punting it downfield, hoping for that someone catches it. So a lot of his voters now are saying, like, what the fuck, man? Like, this is all going to mean nothing. Some of these programs haven't even got off the ground yet. So like what Ford did today in Ontario was, because he wants it's good for votes for Ontario now to go with the $10 a day daycare spaces, which is what Trudeau put through, and with what I think Singh was involved in that. So Ford said, okay, you daycares, you want to have all these spaces at $200 a day in Toronto. That's fantastic. If you don't have $10 a day spaces, all your provincial funding is cut off. So now all these sort of higher end daycares who didn't want the poor people there who can only afford $10 a day daycare are now going to have all their subsidies taken away. So now they're in this weird position of having to basically admit that we didn't want any poor people here. Oh, but now we do, which is going to be great. But anyway, so what's going to happen now in federally is the NDP have a choice. They can either look like complete hypocrites and just keep voting with Trudeau, or they're going to vote with the Conservatives and topple the government, thus rendering all the progress moot.
The problem with the NDP has is that they don't have a big enough support base to do anything other than side with one of the other two.
Well, it's weird because if you're familiar with proportional representation, what they want to do with that, if that was the case, the NDP would have about 20% of the seats in the House, because the NDP from coast to coast, they have about 20 to 23% of the population votes NDP. Like a lot of people where we are vote NDP, but it doesn't matter because it usually always goes Liberal. But across the country, if you look at the numbers, you've got about 31% Conservative, about 27% Liberal, about 20 some percent NDP, and then there's sort of the fringe parties to equal like the 100% of the electorate, which is why if there was no NDP and they all went to the Liberals would have close to 50% of the popular vote, and they would probably always win. But our system isn't like that.
Even though that we're recording a podcast here, I feel like it would be worth mentioning an episode I watched of Veritasium recently. I don't know if you're familiar with his YouTube channel.
No.
It's a lot of it is science-based and math-based, but he did one recently on the democratic voting system that we use. It's based in the United States, of course, because that's where he's from. But a lot of it applies to us as well because we use more or less the same idea anyway. And it's actually quite interesting. In the end, he starts to explore different methods of collecting votes, trying to make it more uh, representative of what the actual population wishes for an outcome.
Did they talk about ranked ballot?
They did. Well, he just discusses of several
Yeah,
actually,
ranked is
uh,
my favorite.
and down to the point of showing how in most versions of political voting, it ultimately boils down to um, uh, generally two parties. It's the only way you can be accurate for a population because it's A or B, you know, this or that. Whenever there's a third party, it ends up being a throwaway vote of sorts at times because it's going to either diminish the one party or bolster another
It really
because
only
those votes
works.
get taken or added to one of the two.
It really only works in a republic-based system like the United States has, like in a parliamentary system like Canada has or like England has. You can have multiple parties, which gives you a better representation of the electorate. But if you have a system like, say, cities, for example, I'll give you Alberta as a great example, where in the last provincial election out there, where Danielle Smith and her crazy conservatives were elected, Edmonton and Calgary went overwhelming NDP. The Liberals barely exist provincially in Alberta, so they go overwhelmingly NDP. The Conservatives hardly won any seats in the cities because the city people know what policies they're bringing in that are like, they take away, like, sure, they might have tax cuts, but all of a sudden there's no daycare subsidies. There's no, the Conservatives love to get rid of all those programs. So what Danielle Smith is doing is what she's trying to do is say, okay, great, you guys didn't want to vote for us. That's fantastic. So we're going to take all the government offices that we can out of the major cities and put them in smaller places. So that would be similar to say in the next federal election, Ottawa, in all the ridings in Ottawa went totally NDP or totally Liberal, but the Conservatives won the election. That'd be akin to Poilievre saying, okay, you guys didn't vote for us, so we're going to pull all of the headquarters of all the government departments out of Ottawa, which is almost every single one. We're going to put one in Sudbury, one in North Bay, one in Halifax, one in Iqaluit, whatever, which is interesting. But a lot of these population centers don't have the populations to staff these buildings. So it's similar to how when Kingston Pen was closed, if you remember, when Harper was in, it was a punishment for that riding going Liberal. So that's the only reason Kingston Pen closed. And I imagine if other prisons ridings in the Kingston area were to go that way, they would close as well. So it could be interesting. But long story short, Singh can vote with the Liberals and look like a hypocrite and say, why did you cancel the agreement if you're going to vote for them anyway? Or he can, because Poilievre, the first thing they're going to do in the next sitting session of Parliament is they're going to try and topple the government. And so the NDP, I think the Liberals need 10 other votes. So they have the Bloc Québécois, they have I think there are two Greens in there, and they have NDP. So really, they only need a few people to vote with them to not topple the government down. But it's very close that we could be in an election real fast, which is very interesting. But Singh is unelectable because he's a visual minority, and a lot of people don't want that, and they also he's not a good leader. So the NDP they have no money to run an election. They don't. So before an election, you're supposed to have a person in every single riding that people can vote for, and if you don't have someone in every riding, then you have no chance of winning. No
Yeah.
chance at all. So the NDP hardly have that. The Liberals don't really have that either, but they have more money that they can say, okay, we're going to nominate Brian to run here just to get somebody up. But the NDP don't have that.
I have a hard time trusting NDP with their current leader, um, only because he's a very smooth communicator to listen to him speak, and that immediately makes me concerned. I mean, they're all practiced oratories, right? They're all public speaking skills are highly trained. But for some reason, him over the others, always comes across as being a little bit too smooth. And
I
that
think that
worries me a little bit because I've that's a tactic to sway people
but
that may not actually reflect your own personal opinions and
but
agendas.
he's in the very unique position of, and Jack Layton, if you remember Jack Layton, he was the
Who
most popular.
everybody, for the
Yeah,
most part, really liked.
but he also knew that he was never going to be prime minister, just because of the percentages I talked about
Yeah.
earlier. There's just no, unless all the Liberal voters vote NDP all of a sudden, the NDP will never form government. So Jack Layton was smart during the debates where he would say, you know, if you want the Liberals and the Conservatives to keep their election promises, send more NDP and we'll make sure they keep them. Not elect us and we'll do whatever you want. He knew he had no chance. Singh is in the same position, but he doesn't want to say that. He knows the NDP will never form government unless some miracle happens. So he all he wants to do is try and convince people that the NDP is a decent opposition party to have in, because they're the balance of power.
Yeah.
But what I think a lot of far left guys don't really understand is in a conservative majority government, which is what we're looking at right now, it doesn't matter if you have the opposition of the NDP because they won't need your votes and they could do whatever the hell they want. And you could have all the NDP people vote against their policies, but if they're in the majority, it doesn't matter. Same with the Liberals. At least in a Liberal minority government, the NDP has some sway, so that 20 some percentage of the population, they feel like they're involved. But if the Conservatives are in with their 31%, sort of like Doug Ford now. In Ontario, 38% of eligible voters voted in the last Ontario election. So whenever I hear anybody talk about how bad the hospitals are, did you vote? No. Would you vote? If you did you vote Conservative? Yes. That's why we're in the predicament we are. But the 62% of the population that didn't vote are the reason why our hospitals are shit. Education is going in the shitter. It's because of those
Well,
policies.
not necessarily,
Oh,
but
totally.
there's a hell of a lot of potential there that could have had a big impact
So
on our political
the NDP and
state.
the NDP and the Liberals in Ontario collectively had more votes, but just not in the right ridings. So if it was based on the popular vote percentage, it would be an NDP Liberal alliance in Ontario too, because together they had more votes than Ford by quite a bit. But federally it's a little different, where you have more people voted Conservative in the last Canadian election than voted for the other two parties collectively. But because of the way the ridings are, doesn't matter. Same in the States. Hillary Clinton had
Yeah,
3 million.
and I don't like that way of voting. It's proportional, it seems. Well, no, that's not what I mean. What am I trying to say? Like certain ridings are worth more seats than others, right?
And there's been an adjustment this year because of population changes on the census. So Alberta has five new five new ridings because they have more people now than they
Mm.
did in the last election. And I think Ontario had one taken away or amalgamated. Can't recall exactly, but as the population moves around, those ridings will change. So if Alberta gets another 5 million people in the next 10 years, they will have almost the same amount of ridings as Quebec. So it really balances things out a bit. Unfortunately, you have all the ridings in Alberta going one party, really, and so it's swayed. Whereas in Quebec, you have some NDP, some Bloc, some Conservative, some Liberal. That doesn't happen at West, so it flips, right? So that's why I like the ranked ballot system. Are you familiar, Ryan, with the ranked ballot
No,
system?
I've very little input on this topic. I'm
Well,
not terribly political.
the ranked ballot means that you would have, let's say, three spots on the ballot. Who's your first choice? Who's your second choice? Who's your third? The first choice only counts once they hit a certain vote threshold to get that seat. Then it goes to, okay, who's your next choice? And the Conservatives don't want this because no one who votes Liberal or NDP are going to have the Conservatives as their second choice. But there are a lot of Conservatives who have the Liberals as second choice and who do not want to ever see the NDP in, but you have to put in a second choice just in case your candidate hits that threshold, because then the remainder of the votes go somewhere else.
So that method of voting system is another one that he touches on in Veritasium. You should look it up.
I will,
It's
yeah.
not that old. I think you would find it interesting if nothing else. But yeah, he talks about that too, and the different outcomes you get with that system. And no voting system is going to be perfect.
But when I think of, like, Ryan's not very political, a system that, I mean, and please don't take any offense, a system that could dumb down the process
Oh,
to
I'm
get
offended.
more people interested. Like, imagine if it didn't look as corrupt and it was a ranked, and so you felt that your say was actually had some sway, right? Which in a ranked system or a proportional system, it would. It's not like in say, you know, Northern Ontario, which usually goes NDP because there's a lot of native reserves vote NDP, and a lot of the people up there like NDP. But they'd have to have a second choice. So once their NDP guy hit that threshold, you have a second option of, okay, well, who gets the next one, right? So that it gives those, let's say, 20 or 30% of the conservatives or liberals up there, it makes them think their vote matters, which it would in that system. Right now, it's first past the post. So if you come in first place, you win everything, right? And that system kind of, I feel it disenfranchises maybe folks like yourself who feel your vote doesn't matter because it's set up that it doesn't. But in that system, it would. That's why I like we need electoral reform badly, and
Oh yeah,
in the states do too.
that I agree.
Like
And
in the states where you had Hillary Clinton with over I think it was 3.4 million more votes than Trump, and she loses the election nationally. Which in the states in a republic system where you only have two parties, why is it based on the electoral college? 3 million people. So that's like the city of Toronto
Mhm.
voting for one person having all those votes not matter.
yeah, which is
That's
ridiculous.
it's very silly.
And it's not truly representative of the public opinion
Yeah, like one thing Trump says in the states is that,
or the voting part, the whole body of voters anyway.
yeah, I mean, and Bill Maher talks about this a lot, which is true, is that when the American system was drawn up, every state had to have two, I think it's two senators. But the population of California, when that document was drawn up, had very few people in it. So South Dakota, if you ever drive through South Dakota, you can go 45 minutes without seeing a house. They have the same amount of Senate representation as California, and California is in the top 10 economies by itself in the world. And they have the same say as South Dakota in the American system right now. And I mean, if I lived there, I would that would drive me nuts. So in a system where you have in the Senate in the United States, you have like 100 senators. If you need 51 votes to pass something, and two guys from South Dakota who have no, like South Dakota hasn't, there's nothing there. They
You
have
just
this,
roll the dice.
but they have the same vote as California. California has like I think it's close to 100 million people or 80 million people, and they have the same voting as South Dakota. That would be like PEI. Seems odd.
Well, it does, and for that reason is why you need a voting system that is going to more accurately represent the actual total population of individuals, and those individuals all vote, and then you get a result out of 100, right? 100%, I guess. Out of 100% of voters that voted, this is how the percentage lay. And
And I think that system works for,
when you have two parties,
yeah,
it,
like
it would be less neat when you've got more than two parties.
and so like I'm a firm believer that there should be no such thing in this country as majority governments.
No, I
Like,
agree.
and
I
so
think
that
that's
way you're forced to have, it's like a tiebreaker vote. You're forced to have one. You're forced to sort of compromise to pass things in a majority government. Even when like I'm a liberal voter, even when the liberals have a majority government, I don't like it because then they can push through whatever they want. But in a majority, like in a minority, what we have now, like the deal with the NDP, sort of circling back to the start of the topic, they needed the NDP to vote with them
Yeah.
to do stuff.
Yeah,
well,
that makes
and
sense.
and that would also prevent um, large swings in focus from left to right, from party to party. If you happen to get a case where one term you've got a majority government on conservative,
Hmm.
and then the next term you happen to end up with a majority government that is in liberal, then you get a massive swing in policies, outlook, focus. If it was a mandatory uh, minority government, we'll say, or more equal government. Yes, you get one that's leading because they've got 51%, we'll say, and the other party's the 49%, give or take. It forces both parties, like you say, to work together.
Yeah.
And then you get, in the end, more of a centralist result, hopefully, than one wildly to the left or wildly to the right.
But you get influences on. So the way I always saw it was, the conservatives have their tax cuts. They all want tax cuts because they think the government shouldn't be in people's lives. A lot of that as a centrist, I agree with. But I also, on the other side, with the NDP, where you have people who like health. Our healthcare system was developed by Tommy Douglas from Manitoba. He's an NDP guy. That's why they were able to push that through in the 60s, I think it was. And so that's a great policy, perfect policy. But the conservatives, that 31% of the population should have some say in how that's administered. And that's otherwise you get the tribalism we have now with like the fuck Trudeau flags and
Yeah.
whatnot. I think those people would be less likely to go that route, even if you hated the prime minister, if you thought that your party had some input on the final decision of the running of that particular piece of legislation. I hate tribalism. It drives me nuts. In the States, it's so tribal. It's stupid. But like in England right now, yes, the Labour Party won the most votes, and they have like a majority government. But you also have all these other parties from certain areas of the country that they have to really watch carefully, because those parties, right now, you might have a majority, but one of those parties could easily sway the result next time. Canadian politics, it's not as much. Like I said, the NDP is never going to be elected federally, but having that compromise, similar to D&D sessions, there has to be some sort of. Sometimes you need a compromise if there's an impasse, right? And in politics, again, if you dumb it down to that level of, we're going to take their say, and the people in the center are going to take those two opposing views and come up with one that works, that everyone can agree on.
Yeah, and you could get even into a case where the party in power is the one that gets to um, bring a policy forward.
Mm-hmm.
For example, this is what we're going to do. For
Mm-hmm.
example, but then all of the groups are involved in the details, and how that fleshes out, whatever the policy may be. All the parties are involved, so it's maybe not necessarily as one-sided.
See,
I don't know.
we're supposed to have that in Canada a
They
little
need to
bit.
work together more than they do ultimately in the end.
Well, the problem we have in Canada also is the Senate. Either you know how the Senate works in Canada?
Of course not. I
Okay.
don't pay that close attention.
Well, you should, because it's super important. So the Senate in Canada, they take the law that Parliament passes, goes to the Senate, and then the Senate is supposed to review it and then send it back to Parliament with corrections, changes, like, oh, we think this is too far, blah blah blah. During Harper's term, guess who had more senators? Harper. Under Trudeau's term, guess who has more senators? Trudeau. Guess who never has any senators? The NDP, because they've never been in a position to appoint these people. And these people are all unelected. They're appointed by the prime minister, and usually they're lifetime appointments, these senators. So you get guys like Frank Mahovlich, who's my father's favorite hockey player. He's a senator. Is he qualified to be a senator reviewing the legislation? I wouldn't think so. But then you also get these really partisan guys, tribal guys who, let's say they're a great doctor out of, I don't know, Winnipeg, but they also gave a lot of money to Stephen Harper, so all of a sudden they're a senator. That's how that system works. So the NDP want to get rid of
That
the Senate.
sounds awfully rigged, doesn't it?
Well, it's ridiculous, but it's a throwback to the British House of Lords, where it's sure you guys can elect whoever you want, common people, but we're still in charge,
Yeah.
which is sort of what the Senate is a little bit. But the Senate is extremely corrupt. It costs hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars a year to administer, and all these people are unelected. And it's getting really tribal now. And I get upset when I go on Twitter and I see senators, conservative senators, basically waving a fuck Trudeau flag. Not saying that outright, but it's heavily against Trudeau. Your job is not. That's not what you're getting paid for. Your job is only to review legislation. Your job is not to try and influence votes, because you're not elected. You're an appointee, right? So it's heavy bullshit stuff going on up there. The whole thing needs to either be abolished or just make it electable. elect senators, because they're supposed to be the oversight, sort of like an oversight committee at a business. But that's not really what's happening. But anyway, but circling back around to close this topic, because I know you guys are really, really, really interested in it.
Well, no, I think that's
Sorry,
my
am I
whole.
projecting my blank stare too
Well, no,
strongly?
it's something that is they really, and there's a reason why they don't teach this stuff in schools anymore, because they don't want people to pay attention to it. They don't want people to know. All they want is to hear talking points from either side about these guys are bad, elect us, and then when that table turns, it's the other party. These guys are bad, elect them. That's all they want you to know, and that's why they're defunding the public school system and whatnot, because they want stupid people who don't question politicians,
Sure,
which is what
because
you well,
it's always was about control, and it's always ever going to be about control.
yeah, unless you elect people who campaign on getting rid of that kind of thing. That's the only way that particular angle is going to
Yeah,
change.
but the trouble is you're needing your electoral body to make that change by votes, and if only 30 some percent of the population is voting, it really makes you concerned about the opinions of the rest of those non-voters.
Because one of the main things I go after as an anti-religious atheist is a lot of the people who vote are older generation religious people, mostly Christian in this country. That could very quickly change to where you have situations like what happened in Minnesota recently, where you have a large Muslim population who was able to convince the mayor. Was it the mayor or the Senate? Can't remember. It's in Minnesota, but now they're doing Muslim prayer calls on loudspeakers across town. And the argument there is, well, the churches have been doing it for years with bells. You can hear it all over the place. So now they have Muslim prayer calls in Minnesota, very similar to what they have in the Middle East, where a guy goes on the loudspeaker and yells that gibberish, calling people to prayer. Same as a Christian bell, really. I mean,
Yeah,
that's what it
if
is.
you ask me, the simpler way to deal with that is just say, okay, well, it's just not going to happen
Yeah,
across the board
for anybody.
for anyone. Yeah,
That's the only way you make it fair.
yeah,
The only way, because now usually in the states now that the Church of Satan are sort of like the I won't say devil's advocate, that's too easy, but they're like the stick pokers. Like, oh, okay, well you want to do that for them. Well, what about us over here? We have a big population of people. We're the Church of Satan. What do we get to do? Because there's I think it was Kentucky or Tennessee, I forget which state it was, but the Church of Satan basically said, okay, you want your manger on the front lawn of the city hall? Great. We're going to get a big statue of Baphomet, and we would like this. So somewhere, I forget what city it was, but they had a statue of Baphomet, like the goat devil,
Mhm.
and it was on a public place. In a fair
I do
situation,
seem to recall hearing about that somewhere
yeah.
a year ago, maybe 2 years ago.
But that's the kind of thing that can happen in this country really fast if enough. Again, this is not racially, because there are white Muslims, there are black Muslims, blah blah. If enough people who are sort of in the middle of the road don't vote, and all of a sudden you have, whether it's a large Sikh population, a large Christian population, whatever it is, if they're the only ones voting, then they're sending people to Parliament with that in mind. It's going to get really difficult for average people in this country.
Well, and the other thing too is when you've got a group of people that are voting, and then such a large group of people that are not voting, it's easy to assume that those people who are not voting don't have a preference. They don't care what the end result is, so therefore it enables the other groups to basically do what they want
And
because you didn't vote.
and
They typically vote unanimously, too, right? We don't.
yes, and in a
We
lot of
get stuck.
cases for what, and there was a case for this a while ago. I forget where it was, but it was basically a group saying that Muslims shouldn't be allowed to vote, and the rationale was that let's say you're a Muslim household with 5 women and one father figure, all of those the females are expected to vote according to what the father tells them to
Yeah,
vote.
so it's not representative of the actual
Yeah,
opinion of the
and and
individual.
and just to clarify, in hardline Christian households, same thing.
Same thing. Yeah.
And so it's not
Yeah.
not singling that out. It's more of an effort to show that in fundamentalist, heavy conservative religious households, whether it's Muslim, Hindu, whatever it is, usually the father figure has the say. Now, whether they go and they vote according to what he says once they get in, who the hell knows? But
Which is defeats the entire purpose of voting in the first place,
totally agree.
right? Because you are imposing your own will over others.
And back to your point about people not voting and saying they don't have a preference, I believe that it should be mandatory to vote. But if, say, for example, Ryan didn't like any of the candidates and he wants to go in and just, there should be an option for none of the above.
You're going to abstain,
You
right?
abstain, and if enough people abstain and it outweighs the any other single party, it's a do-over.
Well, and there should
Because
be, yeah, and there
I would
should be
agree.
contingencies written into policy for that scenario, because if that were the case, we would have encountered that already.
because what it does, and there was an article about this a while ago. I forget what paper it was in, but it was talking about how in
It should
in
trigger reforms, but it should do.
well, yes, but what happens is you get, say for example, a riding in Toronto. Let's say that they only had 20% of the people show up. What that tells the politicians in that region is, we don't need to have a great candidate here. Hardly anybody votes anyway, so we don't need to pay a lot of attention to this
Nobody's
riding.
watching.
Nobody's
Yeah.
watching. It usually, and let's say there's a large enough immigrant population that votes Liberal or NDP, so the Conservatives say, we're never going to win this riding unless you get a government in that sucks, which is what happened in the last by-election in Toronto, where it's been a Liberal stronghold for years. They switched the candidate. They thought should be easy, and they lost.
You know what kind of individuals and groups like that kind of a turnout? It's going to be dictators,
Oh, they love that.
right? They love that kind of thing because there's so many people that just aren't raising a voice, and we don't need that.
And that's why I think it should be mandatory to vote, because even if people go in, even if there isn't the option for the none of the above, just getting people in there to vote and just say, you know, pick the one who you think is. If you don't vote on policy, let's say you don't know anything about how the government works, you don't vote on policy. Just take 30 seconds and figure out which of these people you think would do the best job running the country, and just pick one.
Well, the
Because
other thing too,
at least that is some sort of an indicative representation of, okay, if I, because in a lot of places they use the who would you rather have a beer with matrix. Trump wins that over Harris in the States. Right now, at least the last poll I saw, it's really close between Poilievre and Trudeau. Not a lot of people want to have a beer with Singh, but let's say the average 65-year-old Canadian white guy, let's say you hate Trudeau, you like Poilievre, a lot of those people don't know what policies they stand for, because Poilievre doesn't have any policies out yet. So the only thing
well, he
they're
does a
voting,
lot of criticizing of other
exactly,
policies, right?
the only thing they're voting on right now is, I'd rather him for prime minister. They don't know anything about him, and a lot of the people I've talked to where I am is a lot of their issues are actually with Doug Ford, but they think it's Trudeau's
They
fault.
don't know. Yeah.
And the other thing is they don't like Trudeau because they think he's too feminine. That has nothing to do with policy. That's you don't like the guy because he dresses weird and he looks kind of feminine. I mean, that has nothing to do with what
He just
policies they
says
bring.
too much.
Oh, don't get me wrong. And I'll say, I'm saying it publicly. Trudeau needs to resign, and we need Mark Garneau from the Bank of Canada. He needs to run, because he was running the banks just before the financial crisis. He went over to England and fixed their banks fuck ups, and now he's back in Canada. A lot of people want him to run. That's who we need, for sure. And I'm just going to completely clarify that that's who I'm thinking about, because I'm thinking that I've got the name wrong. Yes, I've got the name wrong. Not Mark Garneau. There's too many people. Talk amongst yourselves for a minute while I look this up.
I'm just absorbing all of the political rhetoric,
Yeah, I
which
completely.
Carney.
I will
Carney.
probably forget almost immediately after this is over.
But it's something that they need to teach in schools, at least in grade 12, as kids are turning 18 and voting for the first time, so they have the slightest clue as to. It doesn't even need to be partisan. They can spend a week on each party and just say, this is what this party supports. This is what this party
That would
supports.
be a
This,
good idea.
and then just say,
Yeah,
we're not going to tell you who to vote for. Now you have a baseline jumping point of which one, and
but
if you align with this,
see,
great.
the problem is they're battling against a population of people that are largely lazy around certain things.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
So
very much.
trying to convince a bunch of people between the ages of we'll say 30 and 18, to leave what they're doing, go to a public place, wait in line, mark on a ballot, and then complete a vote is practically ridiculous at this point. They need to have a digital way of voting for those people.
Do you know who doesn't want that?
However, it needs to be held separate from the paper votes because they're the easiest ones to tamper with from outside sources. So that needs to be monitored independently. Uh,
The only thing I would
there
argue
needs
with
to
you,
be an easier way for people to cast those votes, even if it's an app, for God's sakes.
all they need to do is tie it into the Revenue Canada portal,
Well,
because that
maybe,
everybody over 18 has access to that because they either pay
yeah, unless you're
taxes or.
like me and you forget your password and can't log in every year because
But usually,
you only use it once a
weeks
year.
weeks in advance before the election, they send out the voter cards telling you where to go. It's usually the people have 21 days or so to figure out their password issues. And if you really want to vote enough, if you can't make your Revenue Canada for whatever they're going to call it, those are the people who then do mail, or those are the people who then do in person. Because a lot of people talk about fraud during mail-in ballots. The fraud actual levels are so low that it's almost negligible. Like in the States, Trump lost the U.S. election, and loads of analysts have figured this out. After after he lost the actual election in November, they had Senate runoffs in Georgia and that decided the balance of power in the United States government. He told all of his supporters that mail-in ballots are fraud. That's how they screwed us. Don't mail in your ballots. It's fraud. So in Georgia, all of the Republicans, or a large portion, said, "Yeah, we're not going to do mail-in ballots." Meanwhile, the Democrats are like, "Mail in your fucking ballots, guys, please. We need all these ballots." So the Democrats won both seats in Georgia, and they would not have if Trump had not told people to not do mail-in ballots because they were.
Well, the worst, that's the scary thing because somebody like that has enough sway that he can basically tell his voters not to do something, whether it be right or not, and then just they go along with it without stopping to think first that maybe this isn't correct.
It's a lot.
It's
It,
just
it's very similar to. Well,
people, right? That's basically
yeah,
what it comes down to.
this is the last portion I'll talk about. Then we can get off topic onto something that you guys care about. But the same thing's happening here with the carbon tax in Canada, where Poilievre's talking about axe the tax, axe the tax. Yes, it's increased gas prices, but it's only increased gas prices on average by about 15 to 20 cents per liter on high octane fuel.
Yeah, which affects me.
Well,
And me.
you're a very small but think of the amount of consumers who use high octane fuel in their everyday vehicles. The percentage would be, what do you think? 5 to 10,
Well, there's a lot
Uh,
of people that have
maybe.
sports cars.
yeah, I don't know. And a lot of vehicles are now being turbocharged, and they usually require
Well,
higher octane
how
fuels.
many people do you think follow those rules?
Oh, I don't know.
A
I
lot of
wouldn't even
guys
want to
own
guess.
sports cars.
How many would you think? But honest question,
Well,
like
I
how
have
many do
no.
you
I
think?
have. What couldn't even hazard a guess.
Like let's say in Kingston though, out of 100 cars, how many do you think are high octane sports cars that are sold in Canada? I don't know, but I can venture a guess.
I bet it's 5% or less.
Probably, I would say probably less than 5%.
So an issue like the carbon tax that really is affecting 5 to 10% of the country, maybe.
But that's me.
Of course,
Well, it's
but
100% for you,
100%.
right?
Yeah.
That's the
but
way I look at it.
but people like
Which I need.
your dad who are getting carbon tax rebates are coming from that money, right? So he doesn't drive very much, so he's not putting much gas in his car. So the $400 or $500 a year that he's getting to help with his bills comes from that increase on high octane fuel. So farmers like your uncle, he would also get that and get more than we would because he's a rural guy. So Poilievre isn't telling anyone this. So people who I've talked to some of the people in where I am about the carbon tax. I said, well, that rebate's going to go away. What rebate? Well, the rebate you get on your taxes. And until this year, it wasn't called the carbon tax rebate. It just showed up in people's accounts as like Revenue Canada, whatever it was.
Mm, yeah.
So people don't understand that in rural places, some of these people are getting $1,200 a year back in carbon tax. That money goes away if Poilievre is elected. So those people are seeing $1,200 less. And guys who are, say, over 65 who live in the country, and there's a lot of them who don't drive a lot, like your dad, all of a sudden that money's gone. So people are losing more money than they're actually going to be than they spend on. Because I don't ever touch high octane fuel for any of my stuff except the lawnmower. So I'm not really seeing a huge increase of that. And what Poilievre also isn't telling his voters is the price of fuel goes up every year, long before the carbon tax ever got here. And so the first time I ever filled up at a Canadian Tire gas pump, I filled up my vehicle on $7 because it was 27 cents or 30 cents a liter. So that's how much that's increased even without the carbon tax, because the carbon tax didn't come in until 2015. And in 2007, I can remember it was the highest gas I've ever paid up until last year, which was $1.67, because that was when Hurricane Katrina hit, and the gas pumps went crazy. So it was more expensive then. Like right now where I am, it's $1.41 a liter. It was more expensive in 2005 on that day to fill up gas than it is now with the carbon tax. But Poilievre's not telling anybody that. So that's why I think that whole argument about that particular, and that's his whole policy that he's running on now, is axe the tax. That's the only thing he's talking about. But next year, if he's elected, and you have all those people in the country with $1,200 or even if it's $600 less, they're getting, and for those people, it's basically free money again because they don't drive a lot. Their home heating bill hasn't gone up that much. Like if you're in propane, the carbon tax only increased that I think by $100 every 2 months. It's the companies that are increasing the profit, just like what Loblaws is doing with groceries right now. So they're doing that to offset. They're doing that to increase the cost enough so the public notices. Meanwhile, the analysts say they could take 25 cents off a liter of every type of gas and still make record profits. So is the problem the carbon tax? Of course it fucking isn't the problem. The problem is the companies. But no one's ever going to talk about that.
Well, the other thing too is there's just not a lot they can do about it anyway.
And guess who is going to give those companies the biggest tax break once he gets in? It's not Trudeau. It's not Singh. It's Poilievre. So they want him to get in. So they're inflating the prices. And a very similar thing happened in 2016 with Trump, where in the last few years of Obama's reign, prices started creeping up, and then Trump comes in, and all those companies started cutting their prices because they all had huge tax breaks from Trump. They wanted him in there, so they raised prices to fuck people, and then they brought the prices back down to what they're supposed to be under Trump, and all of a sudden people thought they're saving money. So the whole thing's a scam.
And I think that's my biggest problem. The whole shooting is we all know it's a scam, and we're just trapped.
Yeah.
That's why I say we need that compromise system of no majority governments in any situation.
As far as I can see, the middle class, which is slowly going the right pace for both ends, always has, always will.
I
Doesn't
think
matter what we do.
what we
Might as
need
well just enjoy the ride.
what we need is what they
No
have
matter
in
how often we do.
and a topic for future podcast is I'm looking for a new car because my wife's going to get my blue car and my son's going to get the van. So you guys perhaps can help me find that next vehicle.
I am probably not a good source of.
It's going to be a mistake.
Well, but again, here's the compromise. I'll take your ridiculously impractical Mustang thing, and I'll say, okay, dial that back.
Uh, all depends what you want to
I want
accomplish.
I want something with a little more ground clearance because I'm tall. I don't want to step up out of. I want to just either be level or step down. In my two,
Okay, well that puts like 90% of my choices out.
It's based off the DeLorean.
What's
It's a
what's that?
Hyundai M74.
Oh yeah, I
have you
saw
ever
that.
sat in a DeLorean?
It's going to go into production.
Yeah.
See, but when you're like, I don't want as I approach 50, I don't want to have to be getting up out of a car because it hurts my back and it hurts my knees and it's uncomfortable. I want to be able. I don't want like a truck where I have to step down. I want to just be able to turn and I'm there. I don't want, and I also, because I live in the country, I want something with decent ground clearance for snow that I can have fun driving. I want it all wheel drive.
You want to
I,
Basically, want a Jeep.
I want I want either an SUV or a taller crossover from
Just
my Tucson.
empty every pocket, as my coworker says. That's what Jeep stands for.
Oh, okay. I was like, money? What? I wouldn't drive a Jeep just based on and I apologize to any potential Jeep listeners here. I just don't want to look like a douchebag
Get
while I'm
a
driving.
Tesla, yeah.
And he doesn't want to look like a douchebag.
I love the
That's
idea of it, and I'm a huge supporter of electric vehicles. We're just not there yet in our climate. I'm looking for. I would love a hybrid, but I don't have the
I think
confidence yet.
hybrid would be the only way I would go if I would go. I would not go full electric.
I think we're 5 to 10 years. Like as soon as the grid catches up, or we have stations around, great. I think it'll
But
work
they're
for the.
never going to be carbon neutral because your electricity is generated from what?
Well,
Mostly carbon.
except in Ontario, a lot of it's nuclear, right?
Well,
And so
it's not clean, is my point.
nuclear's pretty good. I mean, it's not like coal is terrible.
So
Ga-
you've got your carbon loaded up front, having to mine everything.
yeah, oh yeah.
And,
I think that with more efficient reactors coming, like the CANDU reactors that Canada has, they're very efficient. And I think another 10 or 20 years of that mixed with better battery technology, where you can have nuclear power generated in Canada, where the only byproduct is steam. That's not bad. Alberta, like,
well, they were working on, is it nuclear fission
yeah,
and instead of fusion? And I'm
it's like the
so
art.
far from an expert, it's laughable. But
The Brits did it though. The Brits, I forget, it was only for a couple of seconds, but they were able to achieve that point where the technology was it was generating more power than it was using, and it was basically like free. Like obviously, there's money involved in building the infrastructure, but at that point, it is not burning any kind of fuel. It's just
it won't be free. Don't
it will
don't
never
be throwing
happen.
that word out because there is no way it's going to be
well,
free.
It will never happen unless companies.
it's going
So
to depend.
you'll see the gas companies
That's
kill
the
it,
but
just
that's the
like they
thing.
did the electric
But
grid,
What might happen
100
is
years
that
ago.
perhaps on your electricity bill you won't have a charge for the usage of your energy if it's so efficient. But the service fees,
Yeah,
however,
there'll be a maintenance fee
will compensate for that.
well, did you ever read about
or
why?
delivery charge.
Yeah.
Did you ever talking about gas companies? Did you ever read about why Dubai is looks like it does now with all its crazy buildings? Do you know why they're doing that? They're doing it because, and the prince, I forget, that was the crown prince, I forget his name, said, we know our oil is finite. We know that we will not be able to produce this forever, and it's coming up soon. So they're building a city so that based on tourism and crazy lavishness to offset the cost of when their oil dries up. And Saudi Arabia is worried about the same thing.
Oh,
And all these
to
places,
offset the loss of revenue
yeah.
when they don't have oil.
So if all of these like there is a finite amount of oil in the planet, and if we get down to the point where mining for oil is more expensive than nuclear, that's when the flip happens. Because if all of a sudden it's not profitable for these companies to produce oil,
You know, it's
they
funny. You
stop.
would almost have to wonder what happens to the space underground where the oil used to be.
Water,
It takes its place.
apparently, yeah,
Hmm, interesting. Well,
or
which you would
or
think.
or sinkholes.
Well, I guess it would depend on how deep it is and where those reservoirs were, but you can't just have these empty voids. They're not going to stay empty forever.
Well, that's what they're worried about fracking, right? Because fracking, they're
Mm.
injecting that high pressure water, and then all of a sudden there's earthquakes in those areas. And I'm not, I'm no scientist. We're not scientists. I'm not settled in the fact that that's what's causing it. But there's an interesting correlation between the rise in minor earthquakes and where they're fracking. Like that's indisputable. These
Well,
areas that have
and I
never
don't
had
care
earthquakes
how
are
precise you think your science is, that process and the result of that process is never going to be 100% predictable.
no,
And
because all that water's got to go somewhere, and
I'd
it's
be
go.
surprised if it's 30% predictable.
But all the thing that I remember, I forget who it was talking about it, but all that water that they're injecting, and it's boatloads of it, it's got to go somewhere, and it's going into somebody's groundwater downstream, whoever those poor bastards are, and
Right,
that's
because you're literally breaking apart
yeah.
rock.
So it's interesting, but yeah, but on a future podcast, well, I'll bring up some vehicles I'm looking at, and you guys can tell me if you think what you think of them.
Sounds good.
That might
Because
be that might be entertaining.
Because I'm looking at buying probably in April or March of next year.